So our presenter today is Brooks Mendell. He is president and CEO of Forisk Consulting. Brooks has 3 decades of consulting, operating, and research experience in the forest, wood bioenergy, and timber industries. This includes roles in operations with Weyerhaeuser, in management consulting with Accenture, and as a faculty member in forestry and finance at the University of Georgia, where he earned his PhD in forest finance. Brooks's forestry-related books include Loving Trees is Not Enough, Forest Finance Simplified, and Aunt Fanny Learns Forestry. With Amanda Lang, he co-authored a book for us in our Forest History Society's issue series called Wood for Bioenergy, Forests as a Resource for Biomass and Biofuels. And in today's presentation, Brooks will revisit that book, Wood for Bioenergy, and he's going to explore the historical context and assumptions associated with wood bioenergy projects and policies, forest supplies, and timberland ownership in the United States over the past several decades. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brooks.
Jamie, thank you very much. Thank you for the intro. And here's what the book looks like, the one you referenced. This is the Wood for Bioenergy book. We have plenty of copies here. So when folks stop by the office here, we're located in Athens, Georgia. We will be happy to share one with you. I'm going to share my screen, make a few opening comments, and then walk through a few slides. And then, as Jamie mentioned, welcome the chance to answer questions or have an open discussion at the end. A big theme of mine today is the importance of controlling what you can, given what you know. That when we survey data over time, or when we try to understand history, one of the reasons that we do that is that we try to learn lessons and get a better understanding of how things actually work in the world or on the ground. In our case, in the particular field of forestry or wood bioenergy, and use that information and those lessons to make better decisions moving forward, whether it's for investments or for our teams or for our businesses. But all these lessons from history, they percolate up through a system of collecting data and applying simple frameworks. And that's a theme you're going to hear from me a few times. This idea of controlling what you can is not a new idea. Many of us dealt with that last year as the pandemic hit, and we had to learn to adjust to sort of new realities. And I'm a big sports fan, and I'm always pulling ideas or analogies from the sports world. This idea of controlling what you can, given what you know. Control what you can, make decisions, the best decisions you can, based on what you know. And one example of that from the past is there was a great NBA, National Basketball Association team executive, a guy named Red Auerbach. If you see him, he passed away years ago, but he used to smoke a big cigar. He was the most successful executive in NBA history. He won 16 national championships with the Boston Celtics as a coach and as an executive. And he always used to do this. One example, there's an old Red Auerbach story when he was a coach for the team, is when he would play teams or had opponents that were a lot faster than they were, he would ask the guys at the Boston Garden to change the nets so that they would have brand new sort of starchy, sticky nets hanging on the baskets. And that way, when people shot a basket, the basket would hang up for just a second before it would come down, and then it would slow up the fast break of the opposing team. Control what you can, given what you know. In college, I played baseball also in New England and had another Boston area coach. Our coach was a guy named Fran O'Brien. We were a Division III baseball team. And back when I played in the early 90s, we had this sort of plastic outfield fence that was stapled to these plastic stakes that were stuck in the ground. And when we were hosting a much better team, a bigger team, maybe a Division I team, they would come and play us. One thing that our coach would do, Coach O'Brien, is he would go to left center and right center field, and he would lift the stakes and he would move the fence back. And then so that they would hit fewer home runs against us, which everybody did, but we couldn't do ourselves. And then when he put the stakes back in the ground, he would leave a little bit of space on the ground just in case one of their sluggers absolutely smoked it, hit it in the gap. That way the ball would roll under the fence and it would be a ground rule double instead of turning into a triple. So you control what you can, given what you know. So we learn from history, we take that information and we apply it in decisions that we make moving forward. Again, that's a core theme for today. So I'm going to share a few things. The first thing I'm going to share with you is I'm going to provide just a brief overview and update on our team here at Forisk. That'll give you a sense for what we do and how we got to sort of the point of view that we have on questions like bioenergy. Then I'm going to spend the bulk of my comments focused on wood bioenergy, just as Jamie highlighted. And I'm going to start with why we got into wood bioenergy, how we tracked it over time, including some of the data and assumptions that we put in place that we wrote about in the book that Amanda and I put in this book. And I'm going to revisit some of those with data from this year. So we have this 10-year gap. Let's see how we did and what we came to learn, and then what we can do differently now moving forward. And then I'm going to spend a couple minutes applying a similar framework to this idea of forest supplies in the United States. What can we learn from historical data? What's a couple simple frameworks, and what can we learn? What have we learned moving forward? And then I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking about timberland ownership in the United States. I published an article also with the Forest History Society in 2016 on this topic in the magazine Forest History Today. So I'm going to revisit a couple of things from that article also that has a historical context and things that we can learn and help us make decisions moving forward. A little bit about our team, Forisk Consulting. We've been in business since 2004. We have offices here in Athens, Georgia, which is where I'm located, and we have another office out in Vancouver, Washington. And basically the core of our research, a lot of what we do is we collect a lot of data and analyze it, but we provide analysis to our subscribing clients to help them make decisions about investments in their organizations. That's what we're doing. We're constantly evaluating wood baskets and timber markets and wood-related industries and helping our clients make decisions. I'm going to highlight two things. One is that our core subscription research is called the Forest Research Quarterly, and we have some clients on the call today. And every quarter comes out this packet of research with a lot of forecasts from around the country, but also some featured research. And this quarter, we're publishing research from a detailed silviculture survey done in the Pacific Northwest with 19 organizations covering 9 million acres. We've been doing detailed silviculture surveys in the South and the Northwest since 2012. And again, as part of this theme, the systematic collection of data, apply simple screens and evaluate it so we can understand what's going on in the field. And the other thing I'll highlight is in the right in the green box, our upcoming conference, September 2nd, Wood Flows and Cash Flows, one-day event. It's virtual, and we would welcome and love to have you in participating at that event. One of the things that's going to come out there, again, is through this simple collection of data, over time, applying simple frameworks, we can learn new things, like we have in wood bioenergy. The wood bioenergy, we use that as a pretty big term, but it really breaks down into three different markets. And these three different markets have very different assumptions and implications under the hood. And we're always evaluating them in the context of the forest products industry. So from Forest's point of view, from my point of view, anything that uses wood is part of the forest products industry because it's going to trickle back and have some implications for forest owners, for forest policy, and even the way that we might think about how the future is going to play out. So what are these three areas? Pellets. Wood pellets is the picture here. It's the first item. That's simply facilities that grind up either low value wood like pulpwood, or they take mill residuals from sawmills, the excess material, they mash it together, they make these little pellets that look like rabbit pellets, and that gets burned either for home use in stoves at homes, but in the United States, the bigger market is really the industrial export market. And those pellets often go to the UK, Europe, where they are combined with coal to produce heat. The pellet market's been around in the United States for decades. And in fact, it's been around for decades, and it actually started out in potlatch, with potlatch out in the Pacific Northwest, where they were trying to figure out things to do with all these residuals they had at their mills. And again, this happened decades and decades ago, and they started to make some of those initial Presto logs, and they were actually shaped like much larger pellets. Even when I was a kid, I went to elementary school near Baltimore, Maryland, and in our home, we had a fireplace, and we often used those Presto logs, which is how those things developed over time. So they relied primarily on mill residuals. Known technology, easy to make, low margin business. Cellulosic ethanol is really the sort of the sexiest area in this area of wood bioenergy. It's where we literally take wood and we turn it into a fuel that we can use in our cars. we have the technology, sort of as they say in the show, The $6 Million Man. We have the technology to do this. The thing is that even to this day, it's very expensive. It's not cost competitive with gasoline and diesel, other products. We've never really, to this day, done it at industrial scale. I'll talk about what that means later, but cellulosic ethanol is another discrete market that falls under the wood bioenergy umbrella. And the third one, and actually probably the oldest and probably the most important, is the wood to electricity and cogeneration. Some people call it CHP, or combined heat and power. At the end of the day, that all that means is people are burning wood to make power and electricity. That's all that means. And really the primary source for that over time has been the forest products industry itself, that would take residuals from their own operations and burn them in boilers to produce power, steam, or heat, or power for their own plants, especially at paper mills or sawmills where they would dry lumber. And over time, this wood is being incorporated in non-forest industry facilities, at schools or prisons or other places, or it's being co-fired. And this has been actually quite important and continues to be a growing source of energy that is derived from wood. Now, we started tracking wood bioenergy projects in detail about 2008. Amanda Lang, the co-author on the book with me, is the one that started this effort. You know, a lot of our research at Forisk comes from concerns that clients have or the questions that they ask us. And since most of our work is about evaluating wood baskets, when we hear the same question over and over again, we write it down, it gets a bunch of tic-tacs, check marks, and then we say, let's spend some more time on this. 2007, 8, 9, remember the context of this period. It's a lot of effort into legislation related to wood power, and we had a recession going on about this time. So when we would talk to our timberland owning clients, after the sawmills were producing less wood and paying less for their logs, they were getting excited about, hey, there's going to be this new bioenergy project opening up in my local area. It's a new demand, a source of demand for wood, for trees I'm growing. Maybe that'll help generate revenue for me and increase my timber prices. So they were excited on that standpoint. And then we had clients that were consumers of wood. They were experiencing the recession as well, pulp mills, sawmills, or others. And pulp mills or OSB plants, guys that make panels that use pulpwood, were thinking, I'm worried about these guys because they're going to compete with me for the same raw material and they're going to drive up our costs. And this is the worst time to drive up our costs. We're having a recession. So we have these different competing concerns going on, in addition to having mandates or renewable energy goals coming from states, some movement on the federal level, and a fair amount of movement happening overseas, especially in Europe. So we started tracking these projects because people were asking, are they going to succeed or are they going to fail? And at the time, we had no idea. So in 2008, Amanda, and at the time, our forest economist, Tim Cedor, who is now an executive with PotlatchDeltic out in Spokane, Washington, the three of us huddled up with a flip chart in our little office at the time. We were behind the Sears and the Dollar movie theater off the Atlanta highway outside of town in Athens. And we were put all the data we had up there, and we were going through the ideas, and we needed a way to separate the good projects from the bad ones, or the speculative ones, or the riskier ones. And we came up with a simple screen. And that screen got improved over time, but the core elements are the same ones we developed at that time. The first one was, does this project use a proven technology? So we had to define what that meant. What does proven mean? It didn't mean that it works in a lab setting. What it means is that this technology has been proven at commercial scale, big full-scale plants out in the world with real customers in a real marketplace, unsubsidized. And they've done it for at least a year. That was our test. Does this thing, has it operated at commercial scale out in the marketplace for at least a year? So of those three types of bioenergy we sort of talked about, pellets have been around for decades, operates just fine. Wood power, making electricity from wood and combined heat and power, decades, just fine. They both passed the screen. And cellulosic ethanol failed the test. So if we heard about a new cellulosic ethanol project, we would track it, but we would assume, our working assumption was that it would fail. Now, at the time, once we developed the screen and we're tracking projects, we were out there giving presentations to different conferences. And I had guys call me who worked at these facilities and say, Brooks, you just told 300 people that we're going to fail. And I would say, whoa, Joey, it's not personal that it's just, that's what we know. The minute that your plant works and is up and running, call me and we'll change the screen and you'll pass. But until that happens, it was a third-party, agnostic, black and white binary screen. And it's to this day, that aspect of the screen hasn't changed. The other piece of the screen was a status check. So there's only two parts. Is the project up and running and consuming wood? It passes. Is the project under construction? It passes. Then if it was just an announced project, we had a checklist of 7 items, and the items are listed here on the slide. Does it have financing? Does it have the permits it needs? Does it have customers? Does it have an engineering contract to get the place built? And this is where we use tracking of simple data, press releases, making phone calls, going to their websites, and we plotted it and we said, well, how many of these elements does a project need to be considered viable as best we know? And we found that the answer was 2. The 2 seems so low. You only need 2 out of 7 to pass the screen, but that's what we found. Is we found that really speculative, far-reaching projects, assuming they pass the technology screen, if they weren't going to make it, they often had 0 or 1 thing. But projects that were able to line up financing and had a customer and had a location, these were really viable projects that would often move down their timeline and pass. So applying a simple screen like this and tracking information, what were we thinking back in 2011? So here's a figure. This is the actual figure from 10 years ago, from early 2011. This figure actually appears in the book. And I put some data up here because what it does is it summarizes all the tracking that we went through at that point in time. And I'm going to highlight a few things on this slide. So first of all, this is a first quarter 2011, January. And at the time, our team was tracking 445 projects in the United States. That means we were tracking 445 operating and announced, which means they hadn't been built yet, wood-using energy projects, pellet plants, cellulosic ethanol projects, power plants. They used wood. And if all of these projects were to succeed within this 10-year time frame covered by this figure, they would consume in total about 124 million tons of wood a year. That's that 123.8. So if, that's the big if, right? So just to provide context, that sounds like a lot of wood, and it is a lot of wood. To provide a sense for how much wood that is, in the United States, the forest products industry during a typical year, not during a recessionary period like 2007, 8, 9, we use a little over 500 million tons of wood. So over 500 million tons. So 123 or 124, that's a big number. Now, we applied our screen, and what did our screen tell us? It told us that of the 445 projects, 292 passed our screen. So we kicked out all the liquid fuel projects. We kicked out pellet projects or power projects that didn't at least have a permit or a location or something else or financing. And the number of projects that were left, 292, we were basically telling the world 153 projects are going to fail. And of the projects that were already operating or were going to pass, they would consume about 68.5 or 69 million tons of wood by 2021. And that's what this red line on the figure is. This is the projects that would pass, and everything else stacked up is wood use associated with all 445 projects. All right, so right, we get the drum roll, we go forward 10 years, what happened? So here's the actual figure that we published January of 2021, this year. 10 years later, I left it in the actual format, so you can see the other figure was sort of retro. This is sleeker figure. And this is the actual data, January of 2021, 10 years later. We're now tracking 420 projects versus the 445, whatever we had on the previous slide. And if they all succeed and pass 10 years from now in 2030, they will consume about 100 million tons. So right away, you can hear that the universe of projects was shrinking over this time. And also you can see from the figure that that liquid fuel slice is very, very narrow. And that we ended up, a lot of those projects, as we expected, they failed, that the technology didn't come to fruition at commercial scale. And you can also see at the bottom of this figure that on the power projects, we split them up between electricity, which is pure power, which is pure electricity generation, and the CHP, which is the combined heat and power. And many of those projects are actually located on industrial sites with manufacturing facilities, many of them within the forest products industry. How many projects passed our screen? 274. Of those 274, 273 of them actually are already up and running. And if they all pass by 2030, they're going to consume about 82 million tons of wood. Where are we today? Today, 273 are running or under construction or directly in the pipeline. And how much wood do they consume today? They consume about 72 million tons. So remember what we thought 10 years ago? We said there's going to be 200, we said X number of projects are going to use about 69 million tons. We ended up with 273 projects that are actually consuming about 72 million tons. So we were off, we were within 5%. But that story sounds too good because it is too good. It is directionally correct, and we learned a lot. But what it doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you about all the failures. What did we miss in this? So as a screen, it turned out to be quite effective. In fact, our screens over time, every year we would back test. And while it sounds like we were really close, the biggest category of projects over this 10-year time frame that you don't see on the slide is projects that got canceled or projects that didn't make the cut, that didn't make the screen. And that group of projects is 340 projects. There were 340 projects, so over 200 that don't even appear on this figure, that got canceled or permanently put on hold between 2011 and 2021. And those projects got put in the cylindrical file for all sorts of reasons. So let's look at what some of those reasons were. So this tracking, the systematic tracking of very simple data and using a very simple screen to weed out good projects from bad projects did a really nice job of telling us which projects or what categories of projects were likely to come to fruition. When we're able to look back at the data, here we learned certain things. One is that there were lots of projects that were coming on the list and falling off the list for all different reasons. They would fail a screen or pass the screen, and their status was constantly changing. When we looked back over time, one of the areas that where we missed the boat a lot was we did really well on categories, but we often missed the status of a specific project. So we'd get this pellet project wrong one way, and we'd get this pellet project wrong in a different way, and they would cancel each other out. And on the project list, they would look good. But the reality is we had a lot of guys falling out of the system for different reasons. One example of something that caused projects to fall out was financing, which I'm going to bring up again. One of the major categories that caused projects a lot of heartache was they couldn't get the financing they needed. So they would fall out of the system. In fact, early in this cycle, 2011, 12, 13, we had companies that they're like the true entrepreneurs, the two guys in a truck running around trying to locate pellet plants who didn't have any experience in the industry. And Amanda and I used to have this sort of informal checklist when people would call and tell us about their project. We had these 3 or 4 things we were looking for. You know, did the person have an engineering background where they understood pellets? Did they have access to financing directly? Did they have someone who actually understood forestry? Did they actually work for a company who had built projects before? And when people would call us, if they had only one of those, we would assume it was a fly-by-night operation. And that's what happened. We had a lot of those guys trying to get in the sector. They would fall out and they would get replaced by, I'll say, real companies or companies that actually had experience in the sector who would come in and build those projects, and they would pass their milestones. And many of those projects are up and running today. So projects were constantly coming on and falling off the list. Liquid fuel projects. This is the cellulosic ethanol stuff. You know, we took a pretty strong position on that in 2011, and we said these projects are going to fail. And we got a lot of pushback on that. So we did a very detailed study of the cellulosic ethanol sector. We hired, as a contractor, a PhD chemical engineer. You may know him, Dr. Bruce Schomburg. He worked with Amanda and me to do a full study. There were 36 cellulosic ethanol projects in our group of 445 projects. He looked at their original patents. We looked at their commercial timelines, what they said they were going to do, and then what we came to believe they were going to do based on what the technologies they were advocating had done in other industries. And what we found in our work is that we believed it was going to take them 8 to 11 years longer to do what they said they were going to do than what they said they were going to do. And who are we? You know, what do we know? but we're just looking at the patents, trying to break it down into simple information, applying a simple screen based on what other people were doing, and took a position. To me, the more interesting piece of information from the study was, of the 36 projects, they used 12 different technologies. So think about that. To me, as a researcher, I hear variance. You know, there's like thousands and thousands of McDonald's out there, and they use one way to make a Big Mac. Now you only got 36 projects, and they use 12 different pathways to produce similar or the same product. To me, these are guys that haven't figured it out yet at a commercial scale. While many of these have been successful in the lab, and we do know how to make fuel from wood, we to this day don't know, we are unable to do it at a commercial scale competitively without subsidies in the marketplace. And we're still 10 years in on this story. The financing is a really big deal. So this became one of the 7 things, it moved right up to the top of the list. As we got smarter and learned things over time, no matter what somebody told us about their project, if they didn't have somebody cutting a check that would pay for the project, we were skeptical. We still applied the same framework, but we really came to understand how important the access to capital was. And not only the access to capital, but is this project even going to be competitive in the marketplace? So pulp mills were really worried about these guys because they were going to be competing for the same raw material. But one thing we learned is pulp mills are powerful in an agnostic, like in a marketplace sense. They have a lot of headroom. They're very powerful projects because they're high margin when they're doing well. And so what we came to understand is that a pulp mill and a pellet plant, that pulp mill is going to knock the socks off that pellet mill 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, just based on the pure normal economics. So those forest industry economics, you know, that's not a great story for some people, but that's just how it works. You really want to understand how these individual projects work at a local scale. And finally, legislative uncertainty really slows projects down. We've had all different sorts of mandates. Just because your state has a mandate doesn't mean you're going to get the projects, because the other things have to happen. They need the capital, they need the technology. You need somebody who's done this before. They need a place to build the plant in an area where they can operate and access the raw materials sustainably. So all these local dynamics are really the things that hold things up. And when legislation gets held up, or when mandates change, or when we don't have a national renewable electricity standard or energy standard, then some of the momentum slows down in these projects, and then they can't get the traction, and then the financing falls apart. And so that legislation, which is going to come up again in a few slides, is a really critical part of how sectors or industries do develop. These markets, no matter what policymakers decide, they thrive actually more on the certainty often than some of the individual policies that we may be talking to. The certainty of it, the solidity, the stability of knowing the rules aren't going to really change for the next 10 or 20 years is quite important for these kinds of sectors. When we look at how legislation has affected the industry, it's played a really important part also in how forests have evolved in the United States. This is a slide that's well traveled in the forestry research sphere. I want to highlight what this slide tells us about the history of forest plantations in the US South in particular. What we're looking at is 60 years of history that ends at 2012, goes back to the 1940s, of pine tree planting in the US South, the planting of pine trees in the South. And this is the 1950s right here. You see this spike. We had a federally funded program called the Soil Bank Program that put a lot of trees in the ground. And then you follow this 30-year cycle, which is about the time it takes for these trees to grow and be mature. And you see another group of plantings, which is a function of two things. One is, if I draw a line here, it's because all these trees we planted here got harvested and we replanted them. So that's what these guys are. But all these guys on the top, we had a new program that built on top of the old one called CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, and that put a bunch of more trees in the ground. And so the forest is getting bigger and bigger, and we'll take that to today because we're getting ready to harvest these trees. And what do we see happen in the marketplace? This is a different slide, so it's got a few different things on it. But one thing about it is, I'm going to highlight first the forest. The forest picks up, actually the forest picks up from the previous slide here, and these aren't plantings anymore. This is the actual size of the pine forest on private lands in the US South. The solid color here is the housing market. This is 2005, the peak of the market, 2 million starts. We go thundering down to 500,000 starts in 2009, 10, 11, and then we start climbing back. And in this figure, the research done on this slide was done 5, 6 years ago. So I'm also taking another piece of history, and we're going to connect it today in a moment. And at the time, we decided to test this idea of how big is the forest going to get. We planted all those trees in the 80s, but when it was time to harvest them, we had a recession. So we didn't harvest them. And those trees kept growing. And what happened? The forest got bigger. And we tested a couple things. We said, well, what happens if housing gets back to a normal level? That's this 1.5 million. And what if houses don't come back and they end up at a lower level here? Well, so we thought we were going to get to 1.5 million 3 or 4 years ago. We just got to 1.5 million. We're going to hit that this year, which is right here. So we had 3 or 4 more years of additional forest growth on top of houses that didn't get built. And we ran a test. We said, how big is the forest going to get? And I'm going to highlight here this little gap between these two forests. It doesn't look like a lot of space here, but actually it's quite important in the size of the forest. The forest in the US South on private lands, it's 2.5 billion tons. And if we had a lot of starts sooner, 1.5 million, we end up at this lower line because we'd be harvesting trees. And if housing developed much slower, we'd end up at the higher line because trees would keep growing until we were ready to harvest them. Every time we do research like this, so we work with Bob Aft at SOFAC. He helps us run these models, the CERTS models it's called. And now we're running these models in-house as well with Tyler Reeves, and Amanda's leading that research. And we're always asking ourselves, where could we blow it on research like this? You know, this is data, and these are models that are based on historic assumptions. So this is another example of the importance of having very basic data collected in a systematic way. If we didn't have that data, you couldn't even conceptualize something like this. But in the United States, we have something called the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. We've been systematically inventorying our forest as a country now we're getting close to 100 years. It's been over 80 years. It was passed by Congress in the 1920s, the funding for this program. And so we systematically measure our forest over time. And that data goes into models like the CERTS model, where we put all that data essentially on a conveyor belt and we run it forward to estimate what the forest is going to look like in the future. That systematic, regular collecting of data, applying simple screens to it moving forward, gives us some information. And we can see that we were expecting the forest to get bigger, but when we thought about where could we be wrong, we understand the problem with historic data. When you build a model off of things that happened in the past, you are assuming that things in the future are going to happen as they did in the past. But what do we know? We know that the trees that we plant today are growing faster than the ones in the past. We know that our forest management practices are more efficient and more productive. We know that technology is improving. And so last year, we did this exercise again. And here's what we learned. This is just the forest in the US South. So we can pick it up again, and you can see that the forest keeps getting bigger and bigger. 2.5 billion tons was sort of where we capped out 5 years ago in our model. We're now here, and we're projecting to way exceed 2.5 billion tons. We're up here around 2.7, but you can also see that on this figure, the forest starts to come down because we finally catch up with all the capital investment in our sector. The issue with a model like this is, again, we were right on the level. You know, what are we getting right and wrong here? We were right on the forest getting bigger. We were right plus or minus, we were right in the direction. We were close on the magnitude, but not exactly right. We were off by hundreds of millions of tons, and we were off on the timing, which is partly a function of the housing markets and technology. And we came to understand this over time. And as we learn those things looking back, we would bake those into our new updates, and that would help us make better decisions moving forward. One more example of how looking at simple historic data can give us information for making decisions moving forward is to look at how the timberland ownership looks in our country. So I'm going to focus on industrial timberland ownership. That means that that's the piece of the forest that is owned by large companies, companies that are really dedicated to the forest industry, or they're highly dependent, or investors that are dealing in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres. The smaller forest owners actually represent a larger portion of our forests, and there's way more of them. Frankly, the bigger guys are easier to track, and because those are the firms that are quite concentrated in the sector, what they do is a leading indicator of what the forestry sector is going to do with respect to wood use and forest practices. The pyramid shows us how concentrated that sector is. The pyramid starts at the bottom with the entire United States. We're about 2.3 billion acres in size of the country. And you whittle down the country down to forests is about a third of the country. And then private timberland, the productive forest, is about 2/3 of that. And private forest is about 2/3 of that. And then you whittle it down to the largest owners. And you get down to the top of this pyramid. And what you see is this space here is we estimate that there are about 85, 87, 90 million acres of industrial timberlands in our country. That's about 4% of the land base. 4% of the land base is actually managed or owned by larger industrial owners and institutions. And it's a pretty small list of people that are in that piece of the pyramid. There's about 300 outfits in that, 300 organizations that are in that piece of the pyramid. Now, let's look at 50 years of history, and let's look at the tiny, tiny top of that pyramid. I'm going to highlight two things on the data side about this slide. This is 50 years of industrial timberland ownership in the United States. I'm going to point your eyes to two things. One is the line here. This is the top 15 owners and managers of industrial timberlands in the United States. That line crosses at about 40 million. So previous slide, we mentioned there's 85 to 90 million acres of industrial timberlands. Almost half of that is owned or managed by 15 organizations, 15. The second that I'll point your eye to is look at how the colors change. The colors change from the early years, 50 years ago, when it was almost all dark green. What that means is that these acres were controlled by companies that owned mills and owned land. And as the colors change over time, it's a function of how the industry has changed, because we had the introduction of TIMOs and the tax code change. So this is the focus of the article that appears in Forest History Today. How and why did this happen? And how did we get to have timber REITs, which are the companies like Weyerhaeuser, Rainier, PotlatchDeltic, and Ketchmark? Those are all publicly traded timber REITs. And several things happened over time. One is that in the early 1970s, Congress changed laws related to what pension funds can do, which allowed them to invest in things like timberlands. TIMOs evolved, and they started to serve those pension funds. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, the forest products industry did a lot of mergers and acquisitions. They started buying each other out and consolidating, and they fuel all that with debt, so that when those balance sheets were really heavy and they needed to generate cash, they started selling their timberland. And who did they sell it to? They sold it to the TIMOs and the institutions. And the third thing I highlight is the evolution of the REITs. In 1998, Plum Creek got a letter from the IRS that said that they could qualify for REIT status. And in 1999, Plum Creek, which has now become part of Weyerhaeuser, qualified as a REIT, which opened up that sector. And when you looked at this last bar, you can see that most of the large blocks of timberland, these are the same acres over the 50 years. It's just the nameplate has changed on them. Is now controlled, owned, or managed by people who specialize exclusively on the timber side, and in fewer cases actually own manufacturing facilities. Last slide. It's a framework that I use to talk about change in the sector, but it's a simple framework that helps explain when we're tracking basic data over time and applying simple frameworks, how and why things happen within the forest sector. You know, on the left side of this 2x2, it's wood markets. Mature markets are markets that have a lot of mills, and emerging markets are markets that don't have a lot of wood demand. So not a lot for timberland owners to sell to. And on the forest supply side, established forest inventories are markets that have a lot of plantations, like we looked at earlier, or they have a lot of wood supply there. And juvenile markets are ones that have younger forests, or they don't have the supply to support mills. And I use the word exploit agnostically in this by its pure definition, but it is what it means here, is that over time, wood using firms and forest owners, what they're doing is they're looking to put themselves, control what they can, given the information that they have available to them, control what they can, given the information they have available to them, to place themselves to advantage on a graph like this. So when you were looking at all those wood bioenergy projects, they were looking for places on the map that had a ton of forest supply and not a lot of wood competition. And when you were looking at timberland owners and forest owners, they wanted their markets where they already own land to attract wood demand to increase the attractiveness and the performance of the returns on their forests. And you can see that by understanding how those projects perform over time and what were the triggers, the simple things that gave us some confidence they were going to happen or were not going to happen, we were able to learn something and help clients make better decisions or help forest owners decide how to manage their forests. And when you look at the legislative decisions made in bioenergy, in forest supplies, and in the timberland ownership sector, you can see that we're heavily impacted historically and today by exogenous factors, things that occur outside of our control. And those things affect really the way that we respond or we react when we make those decisions moving forward. I'm going to stop there. I welcome your questions, and I thank the Forest History Society, one, for publishing this book and supporting our research on this, but also for hosting this presentation.
Well, thanks, Brooks. So just a reminder, if you want to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A that format. We'd prefer you not use the chat format. So Craig Patterson has posed a multi-part question.
Okay.
And so I'll just take them one at a time. He asks if you can address the energy return on energy investment, where it requires significant petroleum investments, what he says is high embodied energy, for biomass while extracting a very low embodied energy, in this case wood chips, requiring energy to harvest, extract, transport, chip, and sometimes dry before burning. So we'll start with that. I think, yeah, so.
Yes, so let's address that, because in our kind of work, one of the reasons that we're evaluating and screening these projects is because they don't lack controversy. There's plenty of reasons why these projects are helpful or not helpful. You know, on the energy content, Craig, your question, and I appreciate the question, and with your permission, I'm going to broaden it even a little bit because it's even a bigger question than that. Like, one reason cellulosic ethanol projects failed is actually related to your question on the energy content of wood. Is frankly the infrastructure and the distribution system that we have for pumping cellulosic ethanol into gas stations and into our cars is inefficient. It corrodes pipes and it's bad for our cars. In fact, so again, I live in Georgia, and we have people here that like the ethanol program or want to see cellulosic ethanol. But when I filled my gas the other day here in town, there was a sign there that says, "We sell gas without ethanol," and they had a line for people. So even on a thing like with pellets, and it's a fair point, right? You can look at where does the math make sense to take wood and turn it into energy, and especially ship it overseas. So there's a couple things going on here. One is that when we evaluate pellet projects, we have always viewed it and continue to view it as a transitional energy source. The goal is that wood pellets does not comprise a big piece of the pie. It's actually a very, very small tranche that meets some very specific temporary needs as we move to other renewable energy sources. And in local markets where you have all this excess fiber that could go to waste, a niche pellet project, especially if it feeds a domestic market or a market that makes sense to ship to, which we have in Europe, those markets that produce pellets in Europe and ship within Europe, the math makes a lot more sense. We have it in Canada as well, and we have it in some of the lake states. Those projects work okay. Also, it's a renewable energy source, so when we're mixing it in with things like coal, it's priming the market for that next technology shift. we have the same issue in energy industries that we do with technology industries. There's a reason we still have phone landlines. Even when we get the new texting and the new phone, we don't automatically ditch the old one. Same thing happens in energy markets. It takes decades to develop a new energy sector, and it takes a century to ditch the old one. We've had coal for a long time. It's going to take a long time to get totally off coal or petroleum energies. And so all pellets are doing is they're providing a temporary transition, part of that story, as we figure out the next thing, whether it's soil or hydro or something else. So standing on its own, you know, it's hard to make the math work on pellets. As a small piece of a transitional energy story, it's a part of that story. It's just a very, very small slice.
Is that where the subsidies really make a difference?
This is where the subsidies, it's a funny thing with the subsidies, because they do make the math work for consumers in the UK to use pellets. And the subsidies were always designed to be temporary. You know, this was a 10-year program that keeps getting extended year by year, but there's been a lot of pushback, so it slows down. So when we look at the pro formas of a pellet project, or and we track all the power plants that consume pellets in Europe and in Asia, that lets us confirm there's a market. If we can't confirm the market, we assume it's going to fail. So in this case, we can actually point to the projects. You know, Drax has real projects. They make a big commitment to these things. And they're also committing to other energy sources as well over time. So that subsidy makes it work. Without the subsidy, it's hard to transport those guys. Domestically, a lot of folks, actually the wood pellet business is a growing business in the US. And so domestically, it actually works fine without subsidies. Everything's close and the pellets are cheap enough.
Okay. And to finish out Craig's questions, he wants to know where the comprehensive analysis that combines all the costs and liabilities with the few benefits. I'm not sure if he's asking, can you point him to, or does this this analysis exist yet?
It probably exists. If it does, I would probably look at the regulatory authority in the UK, DECA, which is on the hook for producing some of this analysis. Actually, the USDA does produce some bioenergy analysis as well, so they do consolidate some of that work. Our interest on our side, we're very focused on are these projects viable locally, because then they affect the way we look at local wood markets, and then is there an end market for these guys over time? We don't take a position on good or bad or these guys, so we don't actually know the math on the inside. But I would look at the UK, DECC, I forget what they stand for, but they're the regulatory authority in the UK that publishes this research, and they're on the hook for it. Actually, in our own USDA has done some pretty good work on this area as well.
Okay. Lynn Wilson, who I have to own up to, is the chair of our board here with FHS. Yeah. She asks if you can speak to the change in percentage by sector, that is liquid fuels, energy, et cetera, that you had up in the 2011 chart and now in your 2021 outlook.
Yeah, Lynn, thank you for the question, and thanks for joining the call. We've known each other a long time, and she's been a huge supporter of our team and Amanda and the society. So thank you. She's been a mentor to a lot of people that I work with. I'll speak high level to that and also talk a little bit about the percentage in the forest industry as well, which I always find that percentage is useful too, because you know, back in 2008, 9, 10, 11, the forest industry was worried, and it echoes Craig's question a little bit, that wood pellets and this other sector was going to vacuum up the forest and put everybody else in the forest industry on the curb. But that's really not what happened at all. In the US South, just generally on pulpwood and fiber, wood energy accounts for about 4 to 6% of the pulpwood use, 4 to 6%. And that's even smaller of the total wood use. So it's a pretty small number. It's a single percent of how much of the wood that we harvest in pulpwood and the residuals end up in wood energy. It's a small single percent number. And where does the rest of that wood go on the pulpwood side? 80% of it's in the pulp and paper sector. I mean, so it's important for people to remember that the pulp and paper sector, even though we've had some shrinkage and rationalization in the sector, we've had some plants close over time, they account for 80% of the pulpwood consumption in our region. And then the next biggest is OSB, oriented strand board. For those of you not familiar with the different wood products, it's like plywood, but it looks like someone chipped a glued a bunch of chips together. And if you see a home construction site, when you see big panels of wood and it looks like a bunch of chips have been glued together, that's what OSB is. And a firm that Lynn used to work for is one of the largest manufacturers of that in North America, in the world. So then when you look at the different within the bioenergy sector, so cellulosic ethanol, energy, and pellets, the biggest bucket of that is power and energy. More than half of that wood is going to electricity or it's going to CHP. In fact, if you look at the data from the EIA, and actually I would point Craig also to EIA, I should have thought of that earlier, the Energy Information Administration, which is a US agency. They also publish data on renewable energy every year. If you look at their data, 75%, close to 75% of the wood that goes to energy is energy being produced within the forest products industry. That's been the case for a long time. So a lot of that energy is being produced within our own sector. Then the next biggest bucket is pellets. Cellulosic ethanol is a tiny, tiny sliver, a low single-digit % of the wood energy sector, and it's no longer going to cellulosic ethanol. It's going to things like biodiesels. There's a little bit of that, a little bit of jet fuel that ends up in planes. Southwest Airlines and Delta and other have signed up for that. But industrial chemicals and industrial sugars are actually important uses of wood into a liquid fuel form. But again, in terms of volume, those are pretty small markets.
Okay. I'm going to just go ahead and let you know we've got a lot of questions, and folks, if we don't get to them, I'm just going to apologize now. But Kit Hart wants to know, do you have plans to re-access the technology screen at the depth you did 10 years ago?
Kit, thank you for the question. You know, it's funny, and thank you for joining the call. Good to hear from you. We have looked at that. I'll tell you one thing that one thing that's been interesting about the technology screen is that we're actually finding, we have looked at this, but we found we're not sure how much utility we would get out of it, because at the big bucket level, we sort of know the story, right? So we know pellets, right? And we know how they work, and we know what their break-even margins are. And so we're actually now spending a lot more time on the status list. Like, did they actually get financing? Did someone actually loan them money? Because it's so important. And then the other thing we're looking at is, where are they? So we look at the map, you know, there's a magical trifecta for an export-oriented wood pellet plant. They got to be near a sustainable wood source. They got to be close enough to a port to export to the UK, and they have to be far enough away from a pulp and paper mill who can eat their lunch that they don't have to compete with them for raw material. And the number of dots on the map for that, they're bespoke. They've been marked, and so those dots are pretty small. On the power side, we also sort of know that story. On the fuel side, we have interest in looking at that. Like we just keep up with it enough, because when the economics work, that would be an interesting industry, but it's very expensive to build one of those plants. It's like building building a power plant or building like a pulp mill, which is really a power plant in and of itself. And the other thing that would really have to make that work, and this gets to this other thing I was talking about, these exogenous factors, you really need a legislative imperative to make a sector like that viable and grow. You know, a sector like that needs a subsidy to get those things built, because if gasoline distributors and car manufacturers don't have to deal with a wood-based liquid fuel, given the choice, they're not going to. And so that's important. The legislative piece is quite important as well. We're spending probably the technology time that we used on bioenergy before, we've really allocated to the forest products industry. We're trying to better understand how efficient sawmills are, which are now 15 to 20% more efficient than they were 25 years ago. And we're also spending that time on panel plants and also on pulp and paper facilities, because they are also much more efficient than they were in the past. And those economics tell us a lot about the sector.
Okay.
Kid, if you think we should spend more time on it, though, send me an email and tell me why, and we'll add it to our list for sure.
Okay. And we'll, Brooks, you want to go ahead and give that email address?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, it was on the Mendell, BMENDELL at forisk.com, FORISK.com. Drop me a note, put in the subject line, the topic. We get a lot of email coming across the transom, so it helps me sort and separate and try to be somewhat timely.
Okay.
Thank you for the interest.
Yeah, there's a number of questions relating to climate change and bioenergy. So there's a wealth of them. Mike Williams asks a pretty timely question here. Given climate change, rapidly increasing wildfires, and the need to increase thinning and fuel reduction on federal forests, are you expecting wood supply to increase on or from federal timberlands? And if so, how are you incorporating that into your analyses?
Yeah, Mike, good to hear from you. Thanks for the question. So I'm going to break that question up a little bit. So Mike, there's a couple parts there. One is because of climate change and the need to manage fires, do we expect to see more removals from public forests? And the answer to that is yes, we do expect to see that because it's the most efficient, most logical, and most operable and practical way to reduce fire risk in places that have a lot of fire risk. I mean, that's just how you do it, is you reduce the risk by dealing with one of the points of the pyramid, and this is the fuel that is overly abundant, and it takes one spark and that thing takes off. So we do expect to see more of that. Right now, we're not incorporating it a lot into our analysis of the wood bioenergy sector. We are using it on our analysis of forest supplies. You know, right now there's not enough to move the needle. Two reasons. One is that when we do that pyramid of timberland ownership, one reason the top of the pyramid is so small is that industrial timberland acres are located where there are really, really good wood markets. Well, the forests, especially public lands, they don't care where the wood markets are. They just are where they are. So we have forests in many places that are overloaded, but there's no local wood markets there. So for the kind of research or applied research we're doing, they sort of become irrelevant until somebody locates a use for that wood. So that's where that 2x2 comes from. You'd have a lot of wood, but no wood market. So how do we use that wood? And Mike, to your question, one of the options for that would be to produce energy. The nice thing, and this echoes to Craig's question, is if we can produce that energy locally, right, that deals with some of the economic issues, because the less we move that wood around, the more efficient and the better the payoff is, both on energy content, but primarily the economics and the logic of even, do you want to burn a bunch of fuel and move cheap wood around? You don't really want to do that if you can avoid it. So we can thin forest, use it some way locally, either to make a product or produce energy. We have a pretty nice chain there. And so we would sort of get involved the minute we see somebody allocate capital to a use for that wood. Until somebody's got a plan to use that wood, it doesn't really affect the market. And so that's how we would keep up with it. Mike, it's super important. That one's going to get a lot of traction over time, that issue.
Okay. Alex Ingram asks, says, you showed the graph illustrating the changing structure of land ownership. How do you see that changing over time? And will there be an increase? Will there be an increase about conservation owners or new ownership groups?
Yeah, Alex, thank you for that question. And I'll highlight a couple of things again about that figure. I have a little bit of a joke about that figure, which is if you notice, this was the top 15, 1-5, right? So there are hundreds and hundreds of people that are large forest owners, and we focus on the top 1-5. So all those folks, they own like millions of acres each. Like these are the biggest players in the marketplace. So one thing is you'll notice that the figure stopped at 2016. And Jamie, I'm glad you didn't give me a hard time about that, because as a historian, you'd say, well, Brooks, we're not important enough that you couldn't update this thing to 2017, 18, 19, or 20? But I could have done that. But the reason I didn't is it looks identical. Nothing's changed. So the colors look identical. And we've had a couple things happen this year that may make it change. Even though some of the names under the hood changed, the colors didn't change at all. The buckets are the same. Why? So Alex, this gets to your question. It's this story about exogenous factors. You know, what's driving change in ownership? It's not stuff happening inside of forestry. It's stuff happening outside of forestry. Congress changed the law. The tax code changed to let REITs come into the game. You know, we had debt issues. And so what we're interested in is there going to be some other major legislative change that causes sort of the fundamental ownership patterns of the largest owners to change? A lot's happening with smaller owners. We have fragmentation, that's a real issue, and we have other issues happening the way forests are managed. We have forests being passed on from one generation to next, and those patterns change the way people manage their forests. But for the biggest players, we're looking for something external to drive that. And it could be in the marketplace, but until we see that, we don't look for big patterns to change there. On the conservation piece, it could change. I will say that the figure provides a misleading profile for the conservation sector because there are so many other players that are smaller in conservation that just don't happen to make that list. Again, we're only dealing with the 15 largest. If we had the 100 largest, you'd see a lot more conservation activity and owners and players, and that list is changing all the time. And maybe it's possible someday that TIMOs or some other player or a REIT, if their structure changes where they're no longer a timber REIT, but they're a conservation organization, that would change the whole figure. But it would have to come from the outside of the marketplace. And when you look deeper in the list, you see some of the things, Alex, that you're talking about.
Okay, we have someone who chose to be anonymous asking, and for Brooks, I appreciate you, and I'm sure our audience appreciates you giving us a little overtime here. The question, the volume of pellet exports in the US has more than tripled since 2012. And the question is, how long do you think this growth rate will continue or could continue?
Thanks for that question. I'll mention two things about pellet exports. It was supposed to be bigger than it is. So even though you're exactly right, the tripling of growth is a massive growth rate. You know, I always joke it's easy to grow when you start from zero. So you know, so the pellet sector, the export sector was really smart, and it has tripled, and it's a real business. I mean, there's real volumes moving offshore. When we were looking forward, in fact, if you were looking at projections 10 years ago, the expected consumption of wood pellets in Europe was going to be twice what it's turned out to be. So that sector is almost half of what it was projected to be if we were standing back in history looking forward. So that sector turned out to be smaller, and most of the growth, to your question, has already happened. So we're not looking for a lot of growth. Most of the places are accounted for. We have a couple wood pellet projects that are in the system to Europe, but actually the growth area is now Asia. So if you're looking for where is the action moving forward, it's really about looking at Japan, what they're going to do. And folks on the East Coast are looking at the economics of going through the canal and others, but you do have pellets really coming from Canada that are going to Asia now, from the BC area and some of those markets. And so, but the growth, yeah, the bulk of the growth, the goodie is sort of out of the system with respect to going to Europe. Most of the growth has occurred. We got a little bit left, but not those kinds of numbers.
Okay, Rajan asks if Forisk has done any research into the topic of replacing coal with, has your outfit done research into the topic of burning wood for replacing coal to reduce carbon emissions?
So this is the coal versus wood in terms on the emission side of it. So we don't really look at that piece of it. We really focus on, are the guys who are going to do that, are they actually going to buy the wood in the first place? How much and for how long? And then that's sort of where we stop. So they do that math, and we're not looking at the next step down the chain. Our expertise is really on the wood side of that equation, on the demand side, the economics of that product. So we haven't looked at that.
Okay. Brian Ratcliffe asks, can you speak? Clearly a name you recognize. Can you speak to the potential in the US for scaling up to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage? How large could this particular suite of technologies get over the next 30 years here in the US?
Hey, Brian, thanks for the question. We haven't looked at that, but we're very interested in this. So we're spending my primary research topic now, and has been since last year, is forest carbon. I've been spending a lot of time on forest carbon, and mostly in the role that forests and forest projects play in this sector. The technologies you're talking about are fascinating. I'm not an expert in this area, but again, I sort of look at this the same way we looked at wood pellets, which is wood pellets is transitional to get us to the thing that's really going to solve bigger problems. And I think the same is true of forest carbon in terms of the current forest carbon markets. the IFM projects and these replanting projects, they don't solve greenhouse gas problems. They are transitional to things like carbon capture or technologies that just don't produce carbon in the first place. So carbon capture technologies are super interesting and exciting. They scale when we get the math right on those. I'm not an expert on those technologies, so that's actually an area that would probably be worth a deep dive, but they do scale. They're attracting a tremendous amount of private equity and capital investment. So that's a signal that people believe it's going to work. They're getting some legislative support in some countries. In the EU, they've already receiving subsidies. So this to me is a growth area, right? We're just learning about it, really. We're just learning how to even talk about it here in the US, where it's already being pushed down the road in other countries. So it's a really good one. And I hope to be more fluent on it in the future.
Okay. Joseph Royce over at NC State, he asks, how do you deal with unknown risk and how do you deal with climate change? And I'm not sure, and maybe you can decipher, the questions to me are a bit vague, but you're the expert. So I'm not sure if he's asking, how do you incorporate that into your analysis work or what?
And Jamie, I'm not sure either. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, how do you deal with unknown risk? And how do you deal with climate change? And maybe he's asking, how do you account for those two things?
Yeah. So I will take a crack at it because I'll highlight. There's the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. There's that line. So I will tell you one thing about when we project work, we do focus on what we know, and we're very explicit about the things that we know we don't know. So I'll give you an example for that. We're updating projections every quarter. That's part of our research. And one thing that we don't project is we don't forecast policy decisions because we have no idea what happens in the back room or on the floor. So we will run scenarios, which is one way we deal with risk, is through sensitivity analysis. We'll say, here's what we expect if the thing passes, and here's what we expect if the thing fails. So that's how we approach policy stuff. We do the same for technologies. We're not a technology expert, so that's why we did the deep dive on cellulosic ethanol. Is here's the way we expect things to go if the technology succeeds, but we don't expect it to succeed given what we know. So here's what we think is going to happen. So that's how we do it, through scenario analysis, and we focus on the. I use the phrase a lot: know what's knowable. That's why we track every wood-using facility in North America, because that's knowable. It takes a lot of work, but it's knowable. And if we know every point source of demand, what kind of wood they're using, how much and why, then we can say something about the local markets, and each local market fits into a quilt, and that quilt is the country and the continent. And then we have a sense for what the forest industry looks like and everything they're doing and what the economics of that sector is. With respect to climate change, I'll tell you one thing that we do spend a lot of time thinking about, other than forest carbon markets, is when we run those forest supply models with CERTs and the FIA data, like we do with NC State and working with Bob App, you know, I pay a lot of attention to what research cooperatives do, or research efforts like PineMap, which is one area where universities got together, combined resources, and tested these models to evaluate the implications from climate change. You know, when Amanda and I talk about supplies, one of the things we worry about is, well, or we think about is, as climate changes, CO2 goes up, it encourages plants and trees to grow faster. So are we properly accounting for that in our models? And one thing that PineMap has helped us with, and Bob Apt has helped us with, is no, we weren't. We've been under accounting for it. And we know that now because we can measure it. So what we found is, one is it matters because carbon accumulates over time in the atmosphere. The other is that the vintage year matters. What year did we put the trees in the ground? So the vintage year of the forest, you know, carbon's impacts on a forest planted in 1980 differs in what on the forest planted in 1990 differs in the forest planted in 2000. So we have to be sensitive to that when we model it. So we got to measure that and account for that. But I think we're finding it's on the order of like close to 1% a year of incremental growth on the incremental forest being planted, increased growth on the growth rate. It's something, it's on that magnitude. And so it's like compound interest. It's not very much this year, but year on top of the year on top of year, you get pretty big growth rates. And it's one reason why our projections done 5 or 10 years ago underestimated the actual of where we are today. partly because of the question you're talking to. So thanks for that question. We think about it on the supply side.
Okay. Doug McCleary, who he's the author of a issue series book for us, American Forests. He says in the past, the industrial forest sector made investments in improved timber growing and manufacturing. Does the current group of forest owners, such as TIMOs and REITs, place the same value on research in keeping the forest sector competitive? And he asks, what does this bode for the future?
Yeah, so this is an R&D question. First, this is ode to Doug, because when I served on my first Forest History Society board meeting, so I've read, Doug wrote a book, American Forests. So this is one of the books like I've read many times. It's to Jamie said, it's the first issue of the Forest History Series. I was so happy to meet Doug and to meet the author of that book. And so, and we cite the book in our work here because, first of all, for someone who doesn't know a lot about forestry or the history of the forest industry in the United States, and this book was written decades ago, right? It was written a while ago.
Yeah, he's done, I think, 3 updates. I have to give him credit.
And it's available online.
Yeah, it's available through our website, free as a PDF.
Yes. And so this book, like if you want a flavor for the history of forestry in our country, it's 100 pages and it's great. So it's a great source of getting your arms around the story of forestry in our country. So I thank Doug for that, because he's saved me a lot of grief and helped me answer a lot of questions. On the R&D side, it's an interesting question, right? Because the 50 years of timberland ownership figure that we showed earlier, where it had in the 60s and 70s, it was vertically integrated forest products companies that owned mills and land, also had R&D. Doug's exactly correct. And it's much easier to fund R&D when you own mills, because mills make more money than land. And so they would do a lot of things at the same time. There were some exceptions to this. Companies like IP and Midwestvaco and Weyerhaeuser had big R&D efforts dedicated to the forest. And I'm leaving some out, but there were much bigger efforts. And now we have some co-ops that TIMOs are members to. But the level of research is different, right? Part of it is purely the economics of it. We have so much wood, and the wood on a relative basis is inexpensive. And so we have a lot more R&D that I can point to, because who am I? I'm one guy who is an analyst in the sector. I can point to a lot more R&D efforts and a lot more capital allocation to research where people are trying to figure out how to use more wood. That's what I see. That's where the effort is. On the pure forestry side, we're so good at growing trees that there's not a lot of as much investment there. There is a lot of measurement and tracking and benchmarking. I mean, we have companies that are producing tremendous seedlings that we couldn't have conceived of 40 or 50 years ago. We're quite efficient in our applications of fertilizer and other silviculture treatments. But on that side, I guess the mission of those forest managers have changed. On the research side, the TIMOs are members of the co-ops, and they do use and access that research, but they don't fund it in-house. The in-house research is more focused on the markets and the economics and less on the silviculture. And so when I look at this, when I talk to researchers or I talk at universities, I'm always like, dude, the forest lab you've got is really important. Please keep funding the forestry research occurring at universities. Forest History Society is important because we can look at how things got done over time and track it and research it. And even when I talk to manufacturers, we have a couple firms in the US that do pump a lot of dollars into their R&D labs. And so that's great. And they may develop an advantage over their competitors over time. When people see that, maybe it'll encourage others to do the same.
Okay, so 2 more questions.
Yep.
Again, thanks to everyone for hanging with us.
Thanks, Doug.
So another Doug, I think it's Pierto, asks, what about forest management costs versus returns? If we spend millions on fighting fires and then slow restoration of those lands, subsidized by taxpayers, are those costs being factored in? And then he wants to know, would it not be wise to subsidize bioenergy, especially in fire-prone areas like California or elsewhere? That's a real interesting
Yes, so there's a lot of moving parts in that. Doug, thank you for the question. I will share that on the forest management and the return side, you have this gradient, right, of forest management activities that happens around the country. So when you have large, like the largest timberland owners and forest managers, you know, if they manage thousands of acres, they wouldn't be doing it if it didn't generate a return. And so I mentioned, like, you know, we do these really big silviculture surveys. So we have one coming out in the Northwest this quarter. Last year we did the South. It covers 28 million acres. And we've been doing that since 2012. And those companies that participate, they do it because they want to benchmark their costs and their activities with other companies. And they are doing it. They are investing, as you said, millions of dollars in forest management, silviculture, site prep, better seedlings, all that stuff, and they're generating return. Everybody always wants better returns. Everybody wants a bigger 401k. All that is true. But in this case, those guys do it because it does pay for them. The thing that scares these guys, to your question about really subsidies, is changes in the tax code. And it's about that stability, is that when a forest owner puts trees in the ground, they just want to know that the rules are going to be basically the same for the next 10, 20, or 30 years. And that actually has as much or more value to them in making those decisions. Although if you want to cut them a check for something in the near term, they'll take it. But in the long term, it's that stability in the market that's really important. And it also lets the mills stay in place and be stable and offer jobs consistently over time as well. Now, your question about wood bioenergy, where we're thinning the forest, that sounds like a viable option, something to look at, right? In these markets that are going to be mostly in very rural locations where the forest is overloaded and we need to thin it down to reduce the fire risk, it is possible that maybe an energy project would be a great idea, and to heat the schools or heat whatever's going on there, which is common in Scandinavia. It's exactly what happens. Maybe those kinds of projects here would be quite smart, and they'd probably meet the needs of local economic development agencies as well.
So I said two more questions, but I'm hoping that Joan Schneider's question is actually kind of a yes or no question for you. You mentioned Sweden. This is why I jumped down to hers, and then we'll come back up to Clark Stevenson. So Joan wants to know, do you track supply from other major wood producing countries such as Canada, Russia, and Brazil? And so, like I said, it's a kind of a yes or no. And if you want to tell us some of those countries, by all means.
Yep. So we track it from the same data sources that you probably would. So for those countries, except for Canada, which we track a little more closely, for the other countries, we're using UN data, FAO data. So the same data that all of us would access online. And we do it because we just want to get the magnitudes right, get a sense for what their acreage is. And so we're getting from the public data sources. So that's how we track it.
Okay. And Clark Stevenson asks, can you discuss what research you have done on procurement risk with federal land and how recent updates to scale treatment on public land may impact wood markets?
So we've done a lot of research on procurement organizations, strategies, and systems, and none related to federal lands on these systems. So we will look at federal supply sources for clients in their wood basin if it's part of their system, and we've done that. But in terms of third-party research that we've published, we have not explicitly looked at the risk from public lands. The exception being is that we do build supply models and forecasts for the Pacific Northwest. And when we did that thing for the South, where the South keeps growing, you know, we do look at the public harvest and what it is and what it does relative to the supply for the industry. And we do put currently, until the rules change, the Pacific Northwest in a box. It's supply constrained. And so if that's partly answering your question, that is how we look at it. We measure it, but we cap what the West can do purely as a function of restrictions or the limited flow coming from public forests.
Okay. Well, Brooks, thank you so much.